perfect. The match hasn't started yet. We got 3 hours at least of entertainment in front of us, and we are by now accustomed to the players' surroundings and to Magnus Carlsen's state of relaxation. Robert, as the match kicks off, he's always leaning back, I don't really care mode, and then before you know it, he's up 10-3.
Did Maxime get a haircut, by the way? His eyes are closed. He's calming himself, meditating. I think he's looking fresh for this fight. And is that a French, football kit? Is he, channeling his country?
Yeah, but where are his snacks? That's the bigger question. If the match kicks off, I don't think he's even capable of playing through an opening without some snacks. The first surprise on move 3.
Knight B to D2. Looks odd because your bishop on C1 is blocking his place, but there we see it. Magnus was B3, bishop B2, fianchettos. He'll eventually break open with a move like C4.
And he basically goes Hikaru mode. Hikaru likes to play this with a 1 knight F3 move order, but a very tame opening choice by Magnus Carlsen. MVL responding another big surprise with a Grunfeld setup. I mean, who would have thought?
Well, it might be a bit surprising just because Maxime, he was playing dodgeball in that match against Wesley So. He was changing his openings throughout. He's made himself hard to pin down. And here, Maxime plays bishop f5, and then Magnus takes this big think and plays bishop e2. You may say 20 seconds, not a big thing, but I think it indicates that this is not preparation anymore. This is Magnus just playing an opening for the sake of getting into novel territory.
And I think that was Magnus' strategy in the early going of this match. We will see if this leads to success. We'll see if he keeps repeating this, but I think he's basically saying, I want to chill out. I want to start with a couple of slow games, positional affairs. I don't want to enter any immediate theoretical disputes against MVL, but we have seen both of these players. You just referenced that in MVL's case, Magnus Carlsen has shown a willingness to change his openings as the match goes along as well. Both of these players, especially Magnus, having just a vast repertoire and vast understanding of different types of positions. Good call. C2, C4 by the world champion.
And typically we see the move C7 to C6 played here just to keep the pawn structure intact. Black does not want to take on C4. That gives white the massive center and better control of the E4 square. So right now that pawn on D5 is very important. So I think that C6, or as you're pointing out, C5 is an option to strike back in the center.
And C5 is the more Grunfeld-esque move, but I think it fails concretely. C5, C takes D5, and you can't recapture because of E4 with a fork on the minor pieces. And despite Robert Hess's sage advice, DC4, the eval bar wasn't happy either. I think we're in the same camp here. Weird choice by MBL.
I think it means he wants to strike with C5, though. I think he wants to play more ambitiously, more actively with his pieces, but you are giving white the center. And after knight takes C4, if you play C5, I believe white can just push that pawn up to D5. And so white's claiming, I have an extra pawn in the center, a D and an E pawn, and things are looking good. But no, Magnus says, I'm just going to castle no D5 right now.
And he just keeps the tension, and I think MVL has the shorter end of the stick here. And in part, that's because of the placement of the F5 bishop. Now, you might say, well, that bishop looks like it's perfectly developed. Well, if you think about it, after C takes D4, knight takes D4, the bishop starts getting harassed. It starts getting kicked around the board, and it doesn't have a way back because of the knight on D7. So black is just a little bit cramped here in the early going, and these are the kinds of positions where Magnus just activates Superman mode.
Yeah, this feels like I'm watching Nihal Sarin once again. The opening doesn't look like anything that special, but you're inducing a weakness like the move B5. A good move in this position from Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, but in the long term, you have so many weak squares, you're pointing knight C4 to E5. That C6 square is often very juicy for a knight to jump into.
And you could carve the C4 square back out for yourself. You could drop the knight back to D2 and then meet A6 with a very typical shot A2, A4. Now, in that position, black can't even push B4 because he loses the A6 pawn. But the larger positional aim of the move A4 is to get yourself that C4 square yet again. So, Robert, it isn't just about occupying a space advantage. When you push your pawns, you're leaving weaknesses in your wake.
And Magnus understands this is a big decision. Do I jump forward with the knight and offer some trades? Or, as Donnie was just highlighting, knight back to D2. It allows queen to B6, pawn to A6. Black maintains control over there on the queen side, gets active, so he chooses knight to E5 and A6 played anyway, but Dunya, your A4 move is very tempting, and I would not be surprised if Magnus takes on C5 here, because if the black knight takes back, then there's also knight into D4, a move you mentioned earlier, hitting the bishop on F5, going for the C6 square. I feel like there's some strategic problems that black is going to find difficult to solve.
For sure. And this is kind of 0.7 mode, right? Magnus loves positions with this kind of evaluation. We saw Nihal Sarin struggling yesterday to convert these types of small advantages, but something tells me Magnus is going to play a little bit differently. There's that A4 move and more problems logistically, Robert, for MVL. If he brings his queen up to B6, which I think he very well might, there's ideas connected to taking on c5 and then sticking a bishop on d4. And before you know it, all of your minor and heavy pieces on the queen side get clustered up, and white's going to have all sorts of threats there. This is already getting pretty unpleasant for black.
It certainly is. And there's also a universe where white could consider pushing the opponent d5. I mean, that it will be tactical more than anything. But this position, there are all sorts of dynamic threats that MVL needs to deal with. The b5 pawn is under attack right away. As you mentioned, queen b6 might walk into a pin. And c takes d4 gives white that c6 square. It's really vital. Black's best move would be b5 back to b7, right? Let me push that pawn backwards to cover some of my weak squares. And that way my pawn isn't hanging on b5 and behind it on a6. So actually, it was a big commitment by Maxime, and now I think he might be regretting a little bit as he drops down to nearly 2 minutes.
b5, b7 would be a game-winning move here. It would immediately equalize. In fact, we'd start talking about a small edge for black. Finally, a decision from the Frenchman as he takes on d4. Now, knight c6 here is a distinct possibility. Is there an exchange sack on c6 followed by d3? Not really. White's defending that twice. Do you think we're going to see knight c6 from Magnus?
He's certainly going to think about it. And you see, he's got his hand on his head. He's calculating because knight c6, queen e8, that looks very unappealing after knight f3 takes d4. Now your knight on c6 has another friend protecting it. The bishop on f5 is under attack. b5 and a6 behind it are threatened. So I believe that knight c6, rook takes c6 might kind of be forced. Otherwise, the position just feels very unpleasant.
Now, you could actually play knight takes d4 immediately. That is an option. And I know Magnus likes these kinds of cagey moves. It seems to blunder a knight, but no. White takes on f5 and opens up the attack on black's knight. Magnus makes a third move as he takes on d4 with the bishop. So, Robert, he's trying to keep the status quo, and I think part of the reason he's taken with the bishop is to deprive the black queen of the b6 square. What do you make of this? I'm a little bit skeptical, to be honest.
Great move right there from Maxime.
Oh, yeah.
Queen to d5, because that protects b5. It puts pressure on b3, connects the rooks on the last rank there. So everything kind of working well for black. And rook takes c1 is a threat because b3 is loose. And not to mention, after rook takes c1, you also put the next rook back on c8, the bishop on f5 defends. So bishop f3, you're mentioning bishop e4 as a response. Even rook takes c1 with queen takes b3 to follow. White has some things to figure out now. So I believe bishop takes d4 was an inaccuracy that allows Maxime to have the type of play he has been seeking.
I think it's a major inaccuracy, and I think now Magnus, down 30 seconds on the clock, needs to start thinking about bailing this game out. He just completely overlooked the move queen to d5. MVL very sharp to start off the game. And let's see if Magnus just decides to bail out, or is he going to keep pursuing complications? He trades once on b5. If you want to draw here with white, Robert, what do you think is the best way to make it? Is it to take on c8 and just go like knight e5 to d3? How exactly does white stabilize this position?
It's a really good question because the knight on e5 is actually a bit loose. Once that knight hops out from f6 into e4, the bishop on g7 hits the knight and the bishop behind it. So all of a sudden, black is the one who is unleashing the threats here. And Magnus, he drops to a minute on the clock. Maxime with about a full minute lead. And the decisions are much more difficult for Magnus all of a sudden. That's the difficulty of chess. One small inaccuracy wasn't a blunder. And now it's Maxime who has the easier position to play.
It is indeed. And now his time advantage has ballooned to over a minute. Imagine what a victory in game one of the black pieces would do for his confidence. Imagine what it would do for the arc of the match, especially compared to how the Fabi match started. 30 seconds for Magnus as he finally makes a decision. He takes on c8. Will he play queen to a1? No, that drops b3. And as we predicted, he moves the knight back to d3. But knight e4, even here, Robert, needs to be seriously considered because that knight could hop into c3 and wreak havoc on the coordination of white's remaining minor pieces.
Yeah, the dark squares are going to be a problem for white. So knight e4 looks like an excellent first move. I'm wondering what Maxime is thinking about, what alternatives there are. You know, knight e4 just seems like the move. I really am not considering anything else.
Yeah, but emotionally, it's hard to part ways with your Grunfeld bishop. I think anytime you're giving away your fianchettoed bishop, that's a major concession. The thing is, with only two minor pieces left and only one pair of rooks, you're not really worried about king safety. Knight e4 is definitely the move. And if you're Maxime, keep your foot on the gas pedal. Don't let Magnus get away with this. And I think he just did with the slower move, rook d8.
And knight f4 comes with the tempo, a shot against the queen on d5. The b5 pawn's still a little bit loose. The b3 pawn can push to b4 at some moment. Well, not after queen d6, as you indicate, but queen a1, your idea. Now the knight frozen in place. You can play knight e8. That's an option, but you're retreating rather than going on the offensive.
And Maxime trying to poke and prod at Magnus's kingside. He's inviting the move f3. Magnus says, hey, you want me to play f3? You got it. And now he's going to move his rook from f1, I think, into c1 or maybe d1. And suddenly, white's pieces are looking quite nice again.
They are. In fact, this bishop on c6 staring, biting on granite, as you'd like to say. The pawn on f3 is blunting its force. No e5 breaks. Finally, the bishop is traded. But now it looks like we've liquidated into a pretty solid position. But there's nobody better on the planet at winning positions just like this than Magnus Carlsen.
Just buckle in and watch. Magnus down to 18 seconds. This is what might give MVL the resources he needs to draw. It should be a draw, but how many of these endgames has Magnus won just in the SCC alone? Not even talking about throughout the course of his chess career. I think he wants to play e4, Robert, to further restrict black's minor pieces. And of course, if we compare, the b5 pawn is far more accessible of a weakness than the b3 pawn. And eventually, Magnus could try to attack it with his bishop, knock the bishop off of the diagonal, but MVL says, no, I'm staying on e8.
This is much worse for black. I don't care about the Eva bar. The king is sprinting to d4, maybe into c5. And what is black doing? Playing on the king side, but here comes the white king.
Cleared G3. Takeoff, air Magnus, and he restricts the knight. MVL's going to play f6, I think. He goes f5, desperately trying to manufacture counterplay.
But what is the counterplay? f4, you can just play g4. Kick the knight right back.
King c5.
No, this is winning.
Oh my god.
h3, it's over.
How did he do that? Again. And bishop takes b5, Robert. The worst thing is it's going to force a bishop trade, and knights are the worst piece at stopping passers. King c6, 1-0.
Also, knight endgames are most similar to king and pawn endgames. So white is just simply up a pawn, no counterplay whatsoever. The knight on e5 protecting everything now goes back to d3, so you push b4 and b5. And the black king, if it tries to stop the b pawn, the white king goes over the king side.
Not to mention that knight e4 is an unstoppable threat. It's going to pick up a second pawn, and then the third one is going to fall.